idea of a pulsar timing array. If you have multiple pulsars in the galactic plane, and if you're observing them very, very regularly, you should be able to localize where the source is coming from and other properties of the gravitational wave. So there is an incoherent and uncorrelated background of gravitational waves out in the universe, which is being generated by many, many mergers of galaxies and supermassive black holes, which is called the stochastic background. And these pulsar timing array experiments are expected to detect this stochastic gravitational background in the near future. In say about a decade or so, when the SKA comes up, we should also be able to resolve out individual binaries of these supermassive black holes. So that's why we need pulsars, and that's why we need to understand how these pulsars behave. And if the pulsar is showing a weird behavior, we should definitely be able to model it. And one such behavior was observed by us in April. So we are the Indian Pulsar Timing Array Consortium. We are a group of about 40 astronomers from India and Japan from various institutes. We have a lot of students and a lot of professional astronomers who work together to study pulsars and their properties. And we take a lot of pride in training a bunch of undergraduate students to do active research, including observations, analysis, as well as all aspects of research. So that's us. So let's meet the star of the day, which is the pulsar J1713. It has a period of about 4.6 milliseconds. It's a binary. Its companion is a white dwarf. And it is one of the best pulsars which is timed out there with one of the lowest noise profiles out there. And in the past, it has shown two different timing events. That is, it has shown at two different instances in the past. In the past, it has shown a deviation from its usual timing residue. And this one is the third, the event which we observed. So as I have mentioned before, pulsar timing and detecting gravitational waves requires continuous observation of pulsars. So while our continuous observations were taking place back in April 2021, we observed that one such pulsar, the pulsar J1713, underwent a profile change. The profile change from what you see down here to what you see on the top. It became slightly narrow, and there was a trailing edge which came up, which was not observed before. So to investigate what was going on, we had a continuum series of observations with the GMRT in two different subbands. In band 3, it was from 300 to 500 megahertz, and band 5, it was from 1216 to 1460 megahertz. We used two bands because it gives us better understanding of what exactly the physics is going on. Band 3, the frequency band 3 is dispersed more by the ISM. And band 5 is not as much, so it gives us more information about whatever physics is going on really close to the pulsar. So this this particular study was conducted on 20 different epochs, that is instances of observation, 14 before the event and 16 after, and 6 after the event. And after reducing the data and analyzing it, reducing radio RFI interference, we were able to study what exactly was happening. So we analyzed it using several methods, and here's the first one. What you see here is an integrated flux profile over the phase of the pulsar. These are MJD just means days. These are just days counting up from this particular day to this particular day. And over here you can see that there is a change in the flux. So every single block here, every single block of rows here is a single day. And you can see there's a clear change in both band 3, that is the 500 megahertz band, and the 1460 band in band 5. There's a clear change at this particular MJD. Accompanied by the profile change. So this kind of gives you a visual representation that the profile of the pulsar did change. To quantify it more, we did some more analysis. So what we did was the 14 epochs, which were for the 14 epochs from before the event, were averaged into a profile, a template profile which we subtracted from how the profile looked like before the event and how the profile looked like after the event. From before the event, if we subtract it out, we basically get RMS noise, and we did some statistical analysis by calculating the standard deviation and the medium of how different it is from the RMS noise. And for the observations before the event, we basically get no deviation, but for observations after the event, we definitely get a lot of deviation. In band 5, we get about 12 times the RMS deviation, and in band 3, we get about 8 times the RMS deviation. It's a clear indicator that there was a profile change. We also studied its timing residuals. As I mentioned before, timing residuals are changes in the time of arrival of the pulse. As you can see at this particular MJD, at this particular day, there's a clear change in, there's a clear about 46 microsecond change in the time of arrival of the pulses. And we also see that the time of arrival is kind of recovering. There's kind of a recovery here. So to model this particular jump, we used a few models. Among some of the models which we used were a model in which changes in the DM were involved. So if there was some interstellar medium activity going on which changed the time of arrival, the model should be able to account for that. The other model which we used modeled for scattering. And the third model which we used had the chromatic index being a free parameter, and the best fit being ended up being the third model, where the chromatic index was a free parameter. What you can see clearly here is the band 5 residuals are clearly show a bigger jump, and the band 3 residuals show a smaller jump. This has a lot of physics implications. We'll discuss this in the next slide. So what exactly are we seeing here? Because band 3 variations are smaller than band 5 variations, it kind of tells us that this is not an ISM event. There isn't some interstellar cloud which is interfering with our line of sight, just causing the change in the pulse profile. This has to be something which is very, very close to the pulsar. Our conjecture is that there was a change in the magnetosphere, orientation of the magnetosphere of the pulsar, and it changed the structure of the radio beams, which we observed, which we quantified as the profile change. And this reorganization of the magnetosphere caused the profile change. The recovery which we see in the previous slide over here, can be quantified to about 156 days, and we think that the magnetosphere is going back to normal. So the event took place, there was a change in the magnetosphere, the beams reoriented, and now the beams are going back to their normal state over a period of, say, 156 days. So that is kind of what we observed. So in summary, we have observed a profile change in this particular pulsar. The profile change is fairly significant. It's the first profile change in which we see a proper recovery. We kind of figure out that this has to come from the source of the change of the profile change is very, very close to the pulsar. It doesn't show glitchy behavior, but it shows more of a mode change behavior, which is associated with changes in the magnetosphere. And we are regularly observing the pulsar. Even today, we have regular observations which take place, and they're trying to model how the recovery goes ahead. It's important that we model these pulsars because these pulsars are a part of the pulsar timing array experiments, various pulsar timing array experiments. And if these pulsars if these mode changing pulsars aren't modeled for, they are going to introduce a lot of noise in the data set, which won't let us detect these nanohertz gravitational waves, which we do expect to detect in the future. So this kind of implores us to model these pulsars better, and these mode changes better as well. So basically, that's my talk. You can find our paper published in MNRS letters here. And if you have any questions, you can contact me or the lead author, who's Jacob Basinga. That's it for me. But there are other talks and presentations by other group members from NPTA. Raghav is going to talk in a few minutes about DM measurements with the GMRT. Nikita has a poster about a very interesting new timing technique which we are using with the GMRT, and Adarsh has a poster on Pinta, a tool which we use to process the data from the GMRT in relation to pulsars. So that's about it. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Neil. So that was an excellent talk. So we have several questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
But firstly, I see that Auritra Kundu has raised his hand. So if you want to ask a question, you can unmute and ask.
Yeah, so my question is regarding a fifth point that you mentioned that this has implications for PT experiments and detection of nanohertz gravitational waves.
Yeah.
So where does this particular deviation or detection stands in the context of detecting gravitational waves?
So as I said before, that the way you detect gravitational waves is that you study the residuals from a set of pulsars. Usually you need at least 2 pulsars to make a gravitational wave detection. So if you are going to observe these residuals, say for example, these residuals over here, and these residuals, if you model the way a gravitational wave interacts with a pulsar, you can model how these residuals will basically look like. And if there are more changes in the pulsar, if the residuals are being changed by some internal mechanism of the pulsar, like the magnetosphere or like glitches, it will basically introduce noise. So I won't be able to tell you how quantifiably how much of this one particular pulsar is going to affect the PTA timing data sets. But as this is the third event from the same pulsar, and the data from this pulsar from many, many years is going to be used in the data set. So this pulsar kind of ends up being suspect. So If you don't model this well enough, it will eventually introduce noise when you try to detect gravitational waves. How much? I don't think so. People have quantified yet. So not just us, but other people have not. But I think it's a very good question and something PTA people should think more about.
Okay, thank you.
And Saurav, so there are some questions in the chat box. So Saurav Natto asked, do we need to perform baseline correction of FDSS spectra before the measurement?
Could you please repeat that? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes, so he asked that do we need to perform the baseline correction of a FDSS spectra before the measurement?
So SDSS is an optical data set, right? We're observing in the radio, so we don't need to. It's a very different band, very different frequency. So no relation to SDSS or optical studies. But optical studies in some ways do inform PTA studies in the context that data from SDSS can be used to kind of quantify how many merging galaxies there are. Which can be then correlated to the gravitational wave background. So we can compare the predictions from PTA gravitational wave background studies, which predict a certain number of galaxies which are merging out there. The background is supposed to predict that. And we can compare it to the optical studies, and we can see if there's a discrepancy, which can basically tell us that there are things in our understanding of optical studies and radio studies which might be different. So that's how you can maybe use SDSS data in comparison to PTA.
Okay, so the next question is from Sheikh Nasim Ali, who asks, can you briefly elaborate on the use of the RFI clean tool?
Okay, so I can maybe like for a bit I can do it, but there's a poster presented by Adarsh, who's one of my colleagues and friends. You can maybe go check that out. He'll elaborate that in detail. But the way it works is generally because there are a lot of satellites which circle the Earth and a lot of radio interference from telecommunication towers. If the frequency ranges match up and if those sources are close to the telescope or in our line of sight of observation, those basically come up in those artifacts basically come up in our observations. So we basically literally have to manually take up the graph. Sometimes before RFI clean was introduced, we had to basically manually see the graph, see where the interference is, and basically cut out that part of the graph to remove data. So RFI clean just automates all of it. I think Adarsh's poster, and he might be able to describe it much better. So I was not involved in developing this tool, but he studied much better. I'll point you there.
Okay, so the next and last question is from Aparajita Bhattacharya.
Yeah.
Who asked that why do millisecond pulsars have fewer glitches?
I am not a millisecond pulsar expert, but recently I attended this talk by a person who was an expert in millisecond pulsars, and it has to do with the internal structure of the neutron star. Where because neutron stars have multiple layers, the crust, the inner crust, and a superfluid layer inside, there is this phenomena of pinning and unpinning of superfluid layers on the inside, which causes these glitches. I don't know the exact physics behind why it exactly happens, but it's a very interesting area of study because it's a very interdisciplinary area in which you have to understand how fluid dynamics works, you have to understand how quark gluon plasma works, and you have to understand the astrophysics of pulsars. So it's a very complex field and something which is being studied. I'm not an expert. I almost don't know anything about it. So.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Neil. So these are the questions. So I think it is time to go to the next talk of this session. So the next talk of this session will be given by Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, thanks. So the next talk of this session will be given by Rajdeep Mukesh Agarwal from IIT Hyderabad. So yeah, Rajdeep, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just a minute. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rajdeep, a student of the Department of Physics at IIT Hyderabad, and my research project is regarding the search for Lorentz invariance violation using the stacked gamma ray burst spectral lag data. So I'd like to start off with a brief introduction of what gamma ray bursts are and how they are a motivation for this particular project. So as some of us might know, gamma ray bursts are extremely energetic explosions, and some of the brightest known events to occur in the universe. And in recent times, they formed the basis for multiple studies to probe Lorentz invariance violation. So Lorentz invariance, in fact, does form the cornerstone of special relativity, implying the speed of light remains constant every time in all frame lengths. But energies up to the Planck's energy, it is detected that this symmetry is in fact prone to violation. And in fact, the gamma bursts are a very essential probe for the same, because the essential implication of LIV is that the photons will have their energies, their velocities dependent on energies in vacuum in case of Lorentz invariance violation. And since the gamma ray bursts have high energy as well as low energy photons arriving at the Earth, whose spectral lab data which we will analyze, so hence analyzing them can be an essential probe for LIV. So the spectral lag data is essentially the difference in the time lag for the arrival of the low energy and high energy photons from the gamma ray bursts, with each spectral lag or each gamma ray burst having a fingerprint light curve of its own. So first I'll describe the data sets that were incorporated in the analysis and how each of them is unique and distinct. The first one was by Wei et al. In a 2017 paper, where this particular GRV was analyzed with the second subburst lasting 770 seconds, a slightly longer one. So 37 independent spectral lags could be obtained from them at a constant redshift of 1.41. And this paper had actually proposed significant evidence for spectral lag transition, which was statistically repudiated in a later paper in 2017 again. The Ellis et al. Dataset comprised of 35 GRVs in a slightly broader redshift range, with the high energy photons belonging to this 115 to 320 keV energy band, and the low energy photons to this 25 to 55 keV band. And the new dataset that was added towards the end of our analysis included measurements from this 190114C GRV at another constant redshift, but this was special because it had a slightly higher energy range as compared to all the GRVs incorporated previously. So this is just a graph basically exhibiting the fingerprint of Lorentz invariance violation in case of the model fitting with respect to the Wei et al. Data, the first data set that we have used. So it was basically plotted first in this paper by Ganguly and Desai in 2017, where they obtained some evidence for LIV in terms of the best fit curves, essentially fitting the data better at high energies as compared to the null hypothesis, as is evident here. But since the fit does not resemble a very robust one, this was also supported by the statistical evidence, which was not more than 3 or 3.7 sigma, respectively, for both these models. So it was not a very significant evidence in favor of LIV. Now we come to the mathematical modeling of the time lag equations, which appears in the spectral lag data. The total observed lag is expressed as a combination of the intrinsic lag due to astrophysical emissions and the LIV induced lag. This intrinsic lag is governed by the equation here, with two unknown parameters, tau and alpha, which are optimized, where E represents the observed energy of the gamma ray burst photons. This is in the source frame, and we convert it into the observer frame with just the redshift multiplication. And this essentially forms our null hypothesis, which indicates that there is no LIV induced lag. Then the next term includes the LIV lag itself, which is the delta T LIV, where n represents the order, n equal to 1 or 2, as expressed in that graph earlier. So that is linear or quadratic violation. And here we have another independent unknown parameter, the quantum gravity energy EQG. With this integral here, including the Hubble's parameter h of z, computed as a function of the redshifts. Since we have different redshifts of various gamma ray bursts in our analysis, we reconstructed this h of z parameter with Gaussian process regression with the chronometer data. So instead of using the standard lambda CDM model, which gives a direct functional relation between Hubble's parameter and the redshift, we reconstructed it from past data, which forms a non-parametric relationship and thereby allows us to compute this h of z for any subsequent redshifts that we have in our data. And in order to model the goodness of fit of the parameters in our models, we define this total error function, which is a combination of error in the time lag as well as the observed energy with a simple error propagation formula. So a small primer on the model comparison techniques that we've used for the different hypotheses that I've just described. This is just the Bayesian model comparison, something we're probably all familiar with. The posterior distribution being expressed as a combination of the prior and the likelihood. So this likelihood is of special significance because that is actually what gives us the comparison tool. So it is described as the Bayesian evidence, integrated as the marginal likelihood over all the parameters. And the ratio of this posterior distribution gives us the odds ratio, with the ratio of the Bayesian evidence being called as the Bayes factor for any two models if this is divided. And assuming uniform prior transforms on both the models M1 and M2, we see that the Bayes factor is in fact proportional to the odds ratio. And using a Jeffrey scale, which quantitatively expresses the strength of model 2 with respect to 1, based on the value of the Bayes factor, we obtain that the value less than 1 would indicate almost negligible evidence for the model in the numerator, whereas the value greater than 100 exhibits very strong and significant evidence with varying degrees of evidence in between. And to determine the goodness of fit of our model, I've used the chi-square function with the reduced chi-square value. So first, a Gaussian likelihood was constructed with the standard deviation being equal to the total error that I've just described. And here we have again the squared exponential square of the true value of the spectral lag along with the one reconstructed with the best fit parameters. And with the Wilks theorem, we get the chi-square expression as the logarithm of this. And a general rule of thumb is that the reduced chi-square should be close to 1 for a good fit of our best fit parameters, where the degrees of freedom nu are equal to the number of data points minus the number of unknown parameters, which is 2 or 3, as we will describe later. So in order to perform the analysis, I've used the dynasty nested sampler in Python, which yields the Bayesian evidence along with the best fit parameters. So these are the prior transform ranges that are used for running the sampler. So as I described, the Du et al. Data, the last data set, has a slightly higher energy range because of which, and it also uses the tau and alpha with a negative sign in its hypothesis. So we just extended the prior to a broader range from negative to positive values to incorporate this change in the null hypothesis for the intrinsic parameters. And obtaining the best fit values from the sampler, the following results were tabulated. So drawing your attention to the value of the reduced chi-square and the Bayes factor for model comparison, we observe that the reduced chi-square does not indicate a significantly good fit in terms of it's kind of more than 10 in all cases. But the Bayes factor does indicate that the linear LIV model can be outright rejected on accounts of a Bayes factor less than 1, whereas the quadratic model does in fact give a strong evidence, a substantial evidence in favor of LIV with a value greater than 1, but still less than 100, which means the evidence is not overwhelming enough. So this was analysis first performed with identical intrinsic parameters tau and alpha across all the GRBs. But then, as said, the last GRB has a significantly higher energy range, which makes it prudent to use slightly different intrinsic parameters and make it GRB dependent to incorporate the difference in the energy ranges. So as a result, we use different intrinsic parameters to model astrophysical emission, and the same analysis is performed again with the results tabulated here. So again, if you look at the reduced chi-square, it's not a very good fit, but at the same time, it is evident that the LIV models, both of them fit much better than the intrinsic model, as evidenced by the values here. And the Bayes factor for both the LIV models is significantly higher, of the order of almost 10 × 78 in both the cases, which indicates very strong evidence in favor of LIV when model-dependent intrinsic parameters were involved. So this brings me to the conclusion of my presentation, where finally, I would just say that two independent analyses are performed with the main source of contention being this GRB in the end that was added, and its higher energy allowed us to just choose two different intrinsic parameters in the end, which gave us robust evidence for Lorentz invariance violation with both the models. So initially, the evidence was only slightly favorable for the quadratic model, but not so much for the linear model. And with the relaxation of identical parameter condition led to a much better approximation in that regard. So our paper was published in the Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics, and I would thank Professor Shantanu Desai at IIT Hyderabad, who's probably not present here, for offering me this project first, and then it culminated in a paper after almost a year of effort. So you could reach out to us with our emails, which are mentioned in both the papers here. The archive and the paper link are cited. These are the other references that were used, and just to show it here, these are the marginal posterior distributions obtained from the sampler again. The Bayesian credible regions for all the best fit parameters with concentric ellipses of 1 sigma and 2 sigma. So all the best fit parameters are plotted on top of the curves here. This is for the identical intrinsic parameters case for all the three models, and then this is for the different intrinsic parameters with again for all the three models. So this brings me to the end of the presentation. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rajdeep. So that was a very nice talk. So we have a question in the chat box from Itovan Chatterjee, who asks, what is the uncertainty of the emission related time lag? Will that not introduce very large uncertainty in the quantity you are trying to measure?
So is it regarding the intrinsic lag, if I'm not wrong?
Moitreo, can I just ask like this? Or
Sure.
yeah, so I'm just my question is that you have a total time lag and you are trying to subtract the emission related time lags and trying to see if there is any time lag due to LIV. So, but in case of gamma ray bursts, the emission related time lags are also not exactly known. So that should have a lot of, that should create a lot of systematic error in the results you get. So what is the quantity of that error and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so like as I described, the total systemic error was expressed as a combination of the time lag error and the observed energy error. So the time lag error that we measured was due to the spectral lag data time difference between with the intrinsic lag itself. So that quantity is taken into consideration.
Okay.
Yes, so I don't see any other questions. If there are not any other questions, then Rajdeep, I just have one question.
Sure.
That here you took the linear and quadratic LIVs, that is you took n equal to 1 and n equal to 2. So
Right.
my question is, why didn't you take the higher order n's, like n equal to greater than 2, greater than higher order? So why did you cut it off at n equal to 2? So that was my question.
So like this, I mean, this was basically what was prescribed by our supervisor. So like this was based on the previous research that was done in this regard. So all of them had used the LIV models up to the quadratic model, but not obtained any significant evidence for any of them. So the aim was to first analyze for this and then try and see in future if it could be possible with higher degrees of invariance violation. So purely based on the prior research that was done and to improve on that with novel hypothesis regarding a slightly larger data set with a more diverse range of energies, we've just taken so far with the 2 levels of LIV.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Nardik. So that was a very nice talk and nice question and answer session. So now we come to the last talk of this session, which will be given by Raghav Girgaonkar from IIT Hyderabad. So Raghav, you can go and start your talk.
Yes. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Raghav Girgaonkar, and today the title of my talk is High Precision Dispersion Measurements with the upgraded GMRT. I will be giving this talk on behalf of the Indian Pulsar Timing Array Collaboration, which Neil gave a great introduction to in his talk, and he also gave a great introduction to pulsars and pulsar timing arrays in general. So the NPTA is a growing collaboration of over 30 astronomers, postdocs, PhD students, and undergraduate students, and has recently become a part of the International Pulsar Timing Array. So I'll just give a very quick introduction to what pulsars are. Pulsars are rapidly rotating neutron stars, which emit radiation in the radio frequency region from their magnetic poles. They're very compact objects with only diameters about 10 to 20 kilometers across and have a high mass of about up to 1.5 solar masses. So pulsar astronomy has been there for quite a while, and it's very useful for multiple fields of physics, and it has also been awarded 2 Nobel Prizes, one in 1974 and one in 1993. So as Neil mentioned in his talk, each pulsar has a unique phase profile. So I'm not sure why this is actually GIF here, it's not working, but and their emission is analogous to that of a lighthouse, where as as the beam passes a line of sight, we see a pulse. So this pulse is what determines the phase profile, and each pulsar has a unique phase profile. And pulsar timing arrays have been set up all over the earth to monitor multiple pulsars across the entire sky. In fact, millisecond pulsars, and these pulsars are then used to create timings of arrival, and which is then used to which will then be used to detect the stochastic gravitational wave background from supermassive black hole binaries. Um, so today in today's talk, I will mostly talk about a very important parameter to consider in terms of pulsar timing, which is called the dispersion measure. The dispersion measure is defined as the integrated column density of electrons along a line of sight, which is basically the integral of the density of electrons along the path which connects the Earth and the pulsar, or any other object for that matter, but in this case, the pulsar. So what happens is, as the pulse of the pulsar travels through the interstellar medium, it gets dispersed by the cold plasma, which consists of ionized electrons, such that the pulse at different frequencies arrive at different times. So the pulses in higher frequencies arrive earlier, and lower frequencies arrive later. As you can see in this plot here, this is a phase versus frequency plot. The pulse at lower frequency, which is 300 megahertz, arrives uh, uh, I'm sorry. Yeah, here it arrives at a different time than that of a pulse at say around 500 megahertz. So this delay, right, is proportional to this dispersion measure and the frequency raised to the power 2, minus 2. So for more details regarding the theory and all the related aspects, you can refer to a book called Handbook of Pulsar Astronomy by Lorimer and Kramer. So this delay of the arrival times of the pulse, since it depends on the frequency raised to minus 2, this delay is prominent at lower we get a better DM precision when we work with lower frequency data and with a higher bandwidth. And these precise DM measurements are really important to build timing models for these pulsars, as our primary goal is to detect the nanohertz gravitational wave background. So here, what we have done at the INPTA is our first attempt to get high precision intraband and interband DMs using our data, which we have observed for over 3 to 4 years. So we conduct observations with the upgraded GMRT since 2018, and currently our observations happen in 3 bands, but I have listed only 2 here for the sake of this talk. One is band 3 and band 5. Band 3 is from 300 to 500 megahertz. Band 5 is from 1200 to 1260 to 1460 megahertz. But in our first year of observations, when we were just starting out, we conducted observations in 100 megahertz bandwidth from 400 to 500, and from 1316 to 1460. So the way it happens is UGMRT's 30 antennas are divided into 2 subarrays, where each subarray observes in a different frequency regime. So what we have done is create a DM time series for 1 year's worth of data for 4 pulsars. A 1 year's worth of data is equivalent to 2 GMRT cycles. And the data which we have used for this has been captured with the bandwidth of 100 megahertz and is coherently dispersed with a single total intensity polarization measurement. So the way we calculate these DMs is we create frequency resolved templates, which I'll come to in a while, with 2 methods. Using these templates, we generate times of arrival using the traditional and popular template matching algorithm, which is also known as cross correlation, which was first introduced by Taylor in 1992. After generating these TOAs for a certain day, we remove the outlier TOAs using Hoover regression, as for some of the other reason, as Neil also mentioned in his talks, these might be affected by RFI. And using these TOAs, after removing the outliers, we fit a quadratic to these TOAs, and then hence fit for DM. Because as you know, the delay in time is proportional to the dispersion measure times the frequency raised to the power minus 2. So fitting for a quadratic and is equivalent to fitting for the DM. And we have created a DM time series for intraband, which is just for band 3, and interband, which combines band 3 and band 5. So I won't go into the exact details of how to make these templates. For that, you can refer to our paper, which is given on archive here. So for method 1, we just select 2 or more high signal to noise files which have high signal to noise ratio, and create a single time average file. And then we use an inbuilt function called inbuilt program called PDMP in a software called PS Archive, which is specifically made for pulsar astronomy, to calculate the DM of his file and compare this DM with the ephemeris or the parameter file for that pulsars to make any changes. Whereas for method 2, we created an analytical template by hand by manually fitting Gaussians, and we use a custom made script to calculate the DM of this file, uh, uh, the time average file, using this template by cross correlation. So after we make these templates are made for both bands and then smooth or denoised using a wavelet smoothing technique. So as you can see here on the top, these are the frequency resolved templates for the 4 pulsars for band 5, and on the bottom it's for band 3. As you can see, they're all aligned, and these are the ones that we used in our methods. These are just an example of what we used to calculate the DMs. So what we do is, for a single day, we generate the TOAs using a pulsar software called PS Archive. And what happens is, this is, as we can see in this schematic, this is the data, and this is the template, and we calculate the phase. What we do is we calculate the phase difference between these two uh, quantities by doing a cross correlation test, as described in Taylor's algorithm, and get a timing residual, which also you might have heard in Nielstock. To remove the bias from our fitting for DM, we remove all the DM related parameters from the file, and also set the electron density for the solar wind to 0, because if the pulsar might be near the sun, it might induce a bias. And then after calculating RDMs, we update this to our parameter files. So as you can see here, is an example of a summary of what happens when you create TOAs. So for this epoch, which is 58538, these are the TOAs for each of the frequency channels. And as you can see, they are you can do a polynomial fit for this. And before that, you have to remove out any outlier TOAs and do a polynomial fit, and then which effectively gives you the DM measurement for that day. And using these techniques, we arrived upon these time series for these pulsars. On the left, it is the time series from method 1, and then from the right is from method 2. And the black is for band 3 only, and the green ones are for band 3 plus band 5. So this plot is actually a median DM subtracted, so the DM minus the median DM of the time series. And the details of everything regarding the median DMs and all the results are given in our paper. For the sake of time, I won't elaborate everything here. But what we observed is, for one epoch in the pulsar J22145, we saw an excess DM. Now we analyzed this a bit more and found that this DM had been affected by a coronal mass ejection event near that epoch. We saw an excess DM of 5 into 10 to the power minus 3 parsec per centimeter cube on 24th February 2019. And this is actually accounted for in a software called Tempo 2, which accounts for the solar wind contribution to the DM. But this was an order of magnitude higher than that. So we had to investigate it. And we found that it was a solar distortive event due to a CME. So here you see this red line is what you expect from the Tempo 2 expected model, but our measurement was quite higher than that. So we had to investigate it more. So what we found out was the CME originated from sometime between 2 and 24 UTC on February 23rd, and our pulsar was observed around 5:30 USC on February 24th. And the direction of the CME was towards the Earth. And by analyzing Omni data, we saw that it might have crossed our line of sight at the time we were observing that pulsar. So using this data, we could extrapolate the size and density, and we expected the DM to to be in excess of 3 into 10 to the power minus 3, but we observed 5 into 10 to the power minus 3. So this excess on top of this excess might have been due to the interaction of the high speed CME and the low speed solar wind. This is a schematic of how the CME might have interacted with the pulsar. As you can see here, the CME is earth directed, and the pulse from the pulsar is traveling along this line of sight, and this might have interacted with the pulse here and giving us this DM axis. And on the right, we can see where the CME was supposedly originated, which is around 10 degrees west of the solar center. So to summarize, in our study, we found out of a DM event caused due to a CME for the pulsar J2145 minus 0750. For each of the pulsars, we obtained a TOA, or timing of arrival precision, of around 1 microsecond or better. And we had a consistent high precision of DM, which was between 10 to the power minus 4 and 10 to the power minus 5 parsec per centimeter cube for the interband data, which is combining band 3 and band 5. So what we could do to make this better is for future DM measurement methods, we can account for something known as profile evolution and scatter bordering. Profile evolution is basically when the profile of the pulsar changes within a bandwidth, and scatter broadening is where the profile of the pulsar gets broadened, which might lead to some bias in our measurements. And we also hope that due to our detection of CME event, this may also drive a coordinated study to look for many more such events in pulsar datasets. We plan to release a 5-year DM time series for many more pulsars by the end of this year. And in the future, we might include all the polarization modes, as for now, we are just using a single total intensity mode for even better alignment of profiles for the templates. So this was my talk. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the very nice talk, Raghav. So we have a question on the chat box. So Samrat Roy asks, can you kindly throw any light on what's the physical process that makes the delay prominent at lower frequencies?
Yes. So as I had shown in my slides, so the delay is proportional to the dispersion measure and the frequency to the power minus 2. So as you can see from this relation, frequencies the delay will be more, and higher frequencies it might be less. So that's why it's more prominent at lower frequencies. The exact theory and all the formulae for this I couldn't go into for this talk, but for more details regarding this, you can refer to the book I had mentioned, which is Handbook of Pulsar Astronomy by Laurie Marine Crane.
Okay, thanks a lot. So Vitovan Chatterjee, I see, has raised hand. See, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask.
So I just had a quick question that you say that this dispersion measure even happened due to the coronal mass ejection. So is it possible to have such an event due to some intrinsic reason, something close to the pulsar, something like that?
You mean an ISM event, or
yes,
something within the
ISM,
pulsar?
or even in the magnetosphere around the pulsar?
If that happens, right, so if something happens inside the pulsar, then I'm not sure if it will affect the DM, because the DM is just the integral of the electron density along a line of sight. So if it will depend on what happens to the pulse as it
light
travels.
is passing through the medium, right? So any intervening medium can cause DM.
Yes. So DM or dispersion measures are not constant. So they might change. Like if you measure one value today, it might not be the same as 2 days later or something, because the DM values keep changing. But what we found out was we found a really excess DM value, which was really, like, out of the out of what you expect. And we also saw if this was affected by any RFI, which also might give us such a jump, but that was not the case. So we had to further investigate and found out that it was due
So
to a CME.
this is because you have more plasma in the interfeeding medium, right? More
Yes.
the value NE
Yes.
is increasing. So I'm saying that, I mean, in the pulsar environment, plasma blobs may be ejected, things like that. That kind of things may happen. So, I mean, I'm not sure that, I'm just asking you that, is there anything in the pulsar intrinsically that, or the pulsar environment intrinsically that can cause something like this? But anyway, I think I understand your answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I see a comment from Neil Kolha in the chat box. So he says that if it was a pulsar related event, it would change the timing residual too, and not just DM.
Yes, yeah, that was also what I was going to say, because I thought, but like since the dispersion measure depends on how the pulse travels in the medium, if something happens to the pulsar from the inside, or something like a glitch, what Neil had mentioned in his talk, it will reflect in the TOAs rather than in the DM, because the DM only depends on what the pulse is affected by as it travels through the ISM, and we did not see anything in that case for here. So we had to look at other things which might have caused this.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Raghav. So if there aren't any other questions, so I just had a small question. You probably said this in the talk, but I missed that you said that you were setting the electron density from the solar wind to 0. So what was the justification for that? I didn't really.
So when we calculate these TOAs, right, we want to reduce the bias, because then because we need to so these parameters, right, they're in the parameter files for which are there for each pulsar. So these are sort of what you say an initial guess. So these are these are fitted, but as to start with, we put it as 0.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So, so we have had all the 4 talks of this session, and so this session is at the end. So I would like to hand the mic over to Aishwarya for providing the ending comments. So Aishwarya, over to you.
I would like to thank all the participants for their amazing talk. For people who want to continue the discussion, can do so on the Slack channel. Also, the posters have been uploaded, so interested people can take a look at them. We shall end the session here and meet again at 12:15 for condensed matter physics and interdisciplinary session of the undergraduate symposium. Thank you.